This evening, our guest will be Osman Sert. Osman Sert is the research director of the Ankara Institute. He'll be joining us to speak about Medyascope editor-in-chief Rushan Çakır's interview with former co-chair of the People's Democratic Party, Selahattin Demirtaş. Demirtaş, who has been kept behind bars at the Edirne prison since November 4th, 2016, evaluated several issues in the interview. He spoke about his article dating from August 17, 2020, entitled, "What is a Strengthened Parliamentary System?" He also addressed another article he penned entitled "A Proposal for an Alliance Model" shared on his social media, as well as other questions regarding the new parties formed out of the Justice and Development Party, as well as HDP's political performance. Here are some of the highlights from Demirtaş's answers that we've translated for you.
I penned both texts in order to open a platform of discussion. These are not issues to speak about and be done with in 2 days. These issues need to be discussed at length. I know all political actors have read my words carefully. My goal is not to discuss these issues around my own name, but to make them part of the agenda. I believe my texts have reached their goals. The first steps to be taken in order to attain a democratic society is to decide with whom this can be discussed and through which methods and principles they can be implemented. The discussion template I proposed in terms of a democratic alliance is the precondition to establish a democracy in the future. Perhaps an election can be won without establishing a united alliance, but democracy cannot. What I am trying to say is that winning an election alone is not enough to bring democracy. It is also important to be clear about the principles and goals through which an election has been won. Each government has a lifespan. They corrode over time and lose the support of the population. In this manner, they lose power. This is also valid for the AKP. But what is important is not to wait for the AKP to run its course and to become a spectator to the oppression and destruction that they cause along the way. What is key is to amplify the fight for democracy and force a change in governance. So instead of having any other party than the AKP become victorious in elections, it is for the most democratic option to succeed that should be aimed. Further, if the fight for democracy receives the support of the population, elections will be conducted sooner and thus change will arrive sooner. In this manner, further destruction and oppression will be prevented. Instead of waiting for the AKP to fall out of power on its own, I say, let us fight for a united democratic alliance. I believe that the entire opposition bloc needs to unite under democratic principles, without imposing any preconditions and without falling victim to prejudices. Each and every politician should stand side by side for democracy in light of the magnitude, gravity, and urgency of the problems we are facing. The people and history will not forgive those who do not or cannot do this. First, we are people, then we are politicians. Our political identity should not come before our humanity. When that happens, it leads to polarization and mutual accusations, preventing all types of dialogue. Politics is exacerbated when, in fact, we have politics in order to come up with solutions.
This evening, our guest is Osman Sert. Osman Sert is the research director of the Ankara Institute. He worked as a diplomatic reporter and served as the press advisor of former Minister of Foreign Affairs and Prime Minister Ahmet Davutoğlu. This evening, he joins us to speak about Selahattin Demirtaş's recent interview with Rushan Çakır.
Good evening, Mr. Sert. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
So let us first look at the overall tone of the interview before going into the specifics. What type of political leader do we see Demirtaş to be in light of what he says during the interview? What can you tell us about his style of address?
First of all, we need to take into consideration that he is an imprisoned political leader. And that's why whenever we are just reading his, statements and, political role or possible political roles, we need to, we shouldn't, forget that he is in prison. And that's why it is very important, and which is showing that he is still having an effect on the Turkish politics, political life, and, a political leader. For 2 years, he is, out of touch of its people, its electorate. But again, whenever he is making a statement, it means something, and that's why it is important. Regarding the content, and it shows Mr. Demirtaş political power. In spite of all the problems of HDP. But whenever you are looking at the tone, we need to differentiate into two different, perspectives. One is very positive. He is open to dialogue. He is open to any kind of, engagement with, especially opposition leaders. And that's why we need to take this as a positive step. But as a second thing is, what is important from my point of view is the content of it. we can elaborate on it with the coming minutes, I hope. You can say any kind of sympathetic, positive sentences, but what is important is how you can feel in it. What is your politics, except from just making some, sympathetic calls to the other leaders. And that's why just talking about only let's come together, let's have a breakfast, no problem. But what you will talk at the breakfast, that is important. And I think there is no reply at Mr. Demirtaş interviews to this question. What is the issue?
Speaking of the breakfast, actually, yes, that is one particular part of the interview, which was especially picked up by other media outlets. And just for our non-Turkish speaking viewers, I'd like to mention that specific part where Demirtaş states that if he were not being held as a political hostage in prison, as you said, he would go to Good Party chair Meral Akşener's house for breakfast with his wife Başak. Demirtaş states that if we concentrated on our humanitarian aspects more, then we would be more willing and comprehensive towards one another for a dialogue to solve political problems. And Akşener responded to this statement, stating that there is a tradition in the Southeast. Even if you are in a blood feud, you will let people in when they knock on your door. Then after leaving your home, the feud will continue. So how do you evaluate this response in terms of everything Demirtaş has said regarding the stance of opposition leaders? Because in the interview, Demirtaş also has a reconciliatory rhetoric even regarding Ahmet Davutoğlu and Tayyip Erdoğan. So is Akşener's response encouraging?
I think it's positive. First of all, she didn't close the doors at the face of Mr. Demirtaş, and that's why it is something positive. But again, the issue is that the politicians, the political leaders, they are not living alone. They are not making politics under oxygen tents. They are representing their electorate. And Mr. Demirtaş need to think and say something about it. If you look at the polls, when you just ask to the electorate, which party you will never vote for, is number one is HDP. 60% of the electorate is telling that we will never vote for HDP. If you look at the other, electorate, Metropol's poll is that, it's about less than 30%. If you look at this same number to Mr. For instance, Davutoğlu's party, to Future Party, is 10%. They will say that never vote. What does it mean that, Miss Meral Akşener's electorate will never vote for HDP? And that's why Miss Akşener is representing these people, and that's why yes, they can come together. If you look at the diplomacy, sometimes where rival faces are coming together, they agree not to agree and leave the table, and that's why having together, having talk, it's no problem. Regarding Meral Akşener, this is the issue, and I don't think that E-Party has a space for maneuver or something like that, unless HDP changes his tone, and at least they need to see that how they can convince the electorates to soften their stance against HDP, and then of course accordingly the political leaders will soften their stance against HDP. Regarding Mr. Davutoğlu, I think his position is a bit more complicated because impersonal, he is a pragmatic leader. He is the first and only prime minister just visited HDP headquarter. What does it mean? Maybe the only politician, Turkish political party leader visited HDP. And again, he was the only and prime minister accepted and met with Demirtaş at the prime minister's office. And what happened after that? Especially after the elections in June 2016, Mr. Demirtaş was one of the only two leaders who closed all the doors at the night of the elections when HDP received 13% of share, which is very important, and he closed all the doors to the dialogue. And the other leader was Mr. Devlet Bahçeli. And that's why these facts are still staying on the ground. And that's why, of course, it is important. I don't want to underestimate the call of Mr. Demirtaş. But what is important is your political stance, your political past, your openness to any kind of political dialogue, not to person dialogue. That is important.
Yes, and we'll talk about, I mean, in the interview, there's also a section where he engages in self-criticism and talks about HDP's stance and attitude as well, and we'll come to that. But in terms of the other opposition leaders and their electorate, Demirtaş speaks about the importance of actively combating the AKP as opposed to simply waiting for the end of their rule to come due to whatever external reason. This is the premise of his democratic alliance model and for a possible strengthened parliamentary system. Do you think this call will have an impact on the politicians of the opposition to propose concrete alternatives to replace the AKP? Because we've seen, in the local elections last year, that, the AKP is indeed, losing some ground. They've lost major cities such as Istanbul, Ankara, and Antalya. So they are losing power, but due to prevailing conditions. But will the opposition, I guess, will these words have an impact on the oppositions to provide a concrete alternative model to AKP?
First of all, the opposition parties already agree on a parliamentary system. They don't need for, Selahattin Demirtaş call or HDP's call for that. I don't want to say that HDP's support, HDP's electorate, 10% electorate support is so crucial. We have seen this at the Istanbul, mayor elections, and that's why important. But regarding a new system, a parliamentary system, all the opposition parties are already agree on it. And that's why they're on the same page, not because Mr. Demirtaş is having such a call, but the call is itself important. But the issue is that the opposition should produce policy to convince people rather than having some arithmetic calculations. We need to sum up, HDP 10%, 25% CHP, 10%, E party, good party, and then, the future party and, the Deva party. But at the end, you need to offer people something new. You should offer people and promise people that you will bring them to a better future. I think that is important. And that's why the issue is that when the call is coming from HDP, I think the question in the minds of the people and the politicians is that who is HDP? Mr. Demirtaş is HDP, İmralı is HDP, or Mr. Mithat Sancar is representing HDP, or Kandil is HDP. PKK is shaping the policy. Who is HDP? And when you are sitting with somebody from HDP, you are talking with whom? This is the question. And that is why I think, first of all, HDP should face with this identity problem. And then it can create a momentum for the political process in Turkey. And regarding AK Party is losing ground, not because unfortunately HDP or other parties are offering much better political alternatives, but they are ruling the country in a very bad manner. Okay, regarding economy, regarding diplomacy, regarding justice, regarding freedom of thought and expression, and that's why they are losing. Unless the political parties will offer much better, perspective for the people, then it will change the general outlook of the Turkish political system.
Yeah, I think that's also something Demirtaş points out. I mean, there needs to be a concrete alternative instead of just waiting for AKP to lose ground. That's the difference between winning democracy and winning an election. Perhaps that strategy would work to win an election, but not in the long term. And I think Demirtaş underlines that. But coming to your comments on the HDP, indeed, in the interview as well, Demirtaş engages in self-criticisms as well as a critique of the HDP. I mean, I don't think we need to count the number of attacks and provocations the HDP has gone through since the elections in June 2015. Just the fact that Demirtaş is giving this interview from prison says a lot. But beyond this, what type of reflection does the HDP need to engage in light of Demirtaş's words? Is there a different attitude they need to adopt in order to have less perhaps problematic relational space within the Nation Alliance? Demirtaş says HDP needs to develop more initiatives for political solutions of problems and for peace. So what are some of, how can HDP make its relations within the Nation Alliance less problematic, I guess?
First of all, you're completely right that, all the mayors are, just cancelled and the government is it is not letting the Kurdish people to elect their mayors. And HDP is losing the mayorship, just they are not able to make politics, their leaders are imprisoned, and that's why HDP is under a very huge political pressure coming from the government. And that's why, in spite of this pressure, they are trying to make politics. But trying to making politics, it doesn't mean that, the electorate, 10% is voting for you, whatever you are doing, and whatever you are not doing. But they need to change this. They need to produce new policies. For instance, since we have discussed about Mr. Davutoğlu, there are some very, harsh criticism, very right criticism regarding Mr. Davutoğlu, what he is telling about mother tongue, the native language. He is giving a reply, whether it is convincing or not, it doesn't matter, but there's a harsh, real question, and there's a reply on it. Regarding, the handicap operations in Diyarbakir, in Nusaybin, in Sur, and he is making an explanation. Again, the HDP should make a statement and an explanation not to the state, to the people. Why the people are not, 60% are never voting for HDP. If they can change this, perception, I don't want to say that, regarding PKK, they shouldn't touch with PKK, but the state itself just sat to the table with PKK, made a bargaining with, a negotiation with PKK. This is the reality. Not to accept what they are doing, but as the reality. I don't want to, underestimate the importance of this, but HDP itself should question itself regarding how they are represented to the Kurdish people. When you look at the member of parliaments at the parliament, they are not representing the traditional Kurdish politician, but they are much far leftist. And these are the questions HDP should question itself and then produce some, viable policies, and some policies creating bridges between different parts of the electorate. And then I think the other politicians will feel themselves much more easy and free to sit and talk with HDP. That is the important thing, I think.
Thank you, Osman Sert, for having joined us this evening.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.
Next on our bulletin are the developments regarding the coronavirus in Turkey. The sharp rise in positive cases and deaths continues across the country.
The Ministry of Interior has sent an additional circular to all governors' offices across Turkey. The wearing of masks in all public areas in the 81 provinces in Turkey is now mandatory. Citizens are obliged to wear masks without exception in all areas: public areas, avenues, streets, parks, gardens, picnic areas, beaches, public transportation vehicles, workplaces, factories, etc., across the country, excluding residences. The circular stipulates the restrictions on weddings and ceremonies previously in effect in only 14 provinces in Turkey will be expanded to all 81 provinces of the country. Large gatherings, such as outdoor weddings and other traditional celebrations, will be toned down. The duration of a wedding ceremony has been limited to an hour, with a ban on dancing and serving food. The circular has also prohibited food and entertainment establishments from having live or recorded music after midnight. The circular indicates that no standing passengers will be allowed in minibuses and in intercity public transportation vehicles. Turkey's Education and Science Workers Union revealed that there are some 172 schools in Turkey where COVID-19 cases have been detected in staff and teachers. The announcement comes as teachers are holding online makeup classes for the upcoming school year, scheduled to start on September 21st. Precautions taken against the pandemic by educational institutions are not sufficient, the union added, and they hope to help the public take measures themselves to shield against the pandemic. High-profile Turkish politicians contracting the virus have been on the rise. Most recently, former Deputy Prime Minister Bülent Arınç announced that his and his wife's coronavirus tests came out positive. He said via his Twitter account that their treatments will be led from their house. Moreover, Antalya Metropolitan Mayor Muhittin Böcek from the main opposition Republican People's Party, who had tested positive for the coronavirus on August 15th, continues his treatment in the intensive care unit. Due to Böcek's chronic asthma, he was put to sleep so as to prevent further damage to his lungs. CHP spokesperson Faik Öztrak has announced that he too has contracted the virus. Öztrak, who is 66 years old, said that he is in good health and entered home quarantine. He also asked everyone who came into contact with him to get tested for COVID-19. Previously, Binali Yıldırım, a lawmaker from the ruling Justice and Development Party, who served as Prime Minister under President Erdogan, had announced last week that he tested positive for the virus. Democracy and Progress Party chair Ali Babacan had also announced that he was infected with the virus. Northern Cyprus has announced that it suspends flights from Turkey from September 9 until September 13th, with the exception of emergency flights as well as military and medical planes.
Free speech trials of many Turkish journalists resumed in courts this week. Press freedom cases are once again on the headlines as courts work through the accumulated trials that were suspended earlier this year due to the coronavirus pandemic.
Oda TV and Yeni Yaşam journalists who were arrested in March 2020 for reporting on the death of a Turkish intelligence agent in Libya appeared before the Istanbul 34th High Criminal Court for the second hearing of their trial. They were accused of disclosing information relating to the security and political interests of the state and obtaining documents and information relating to the National Intelligence Organization's duties and operations. From the 7 journalists arrested in March, Oda TV News Director Barış Terkoğlu, Yeni Yaşam newspaper Editor-in-Chief Ferhat Çelik, and Managing Editor Aydın Keser were released during the first hearing on June 25th. Meanwhile, Oda TV Editor-in-Chief Barış Pehlivan, Manisa correspondent Hülya Kılınç, and Yeni Çağ newspaper columnist Murat Ağırel remained behind bars. The journalists stood before the second hearing of their trial on September 9th, where the court ruled for their eviction. This case is one of the many trials on press freedom in Turkey, as 23 journalists are facing trials this week. On the same day, the Özgür Gündem newspaper trial was held, in which 4 journalists faced terrorism-related charges due to their collaboration with the newspaper that is now shut down. However, the trial for Zana Bilirkaya, İnan Kızılkaya, Kemal Sancılı, and Eren Keskin was adjourned to December 24th after their lawyers signed a petition to be excused from the hearing. The trials of ETHA editor Semiha Şahin and reporter Pınar Gayip, who faced membership of a terrorist organization and making terrorist propaganda, were to resume on September 9th. However, the trial had to be adjourned to December 22nd since the 2 journalists did not attend the hearing. Free speech trials continued on September 10th with the journalist Pelin Ünker and the chairman of the Cumhuriyet Foundation's executive board Orhan Erinç, where they appeared for their 5th trial after being sued by Çalık Holding for reporting on the Paradise Papers and the Minister of Treasury and Finance Berat Albayrak's offshore accounts. Among the many journalist trials on Thursday were İleri Haber's editor-in-chief Onur Emre Yağan, who was charged with insulting the president for sharing 4 tweets from the newspaper's official account. The court decision for the compensation case filed against Oda TV's Ankara News Director Müyesser Yıldız by Minister of Defense Hulusi Akar was determined on September 10th. Yıldız and Akar filed 2 cases against one another in 2018. As Yıldız's compensation case was rejected by the court, the Minister of Defense won his trial. The court decided for Yıldız to pay 20,000 Turkish liras to Akar for directing the public's hatred and animosity by imaginary, surreal, and ideologic reporting that aided FETÖ. Meanwhile, Yıldız remains behind bars for the espionage case that the aforementioned Oda TV journalists have been evicted from.
Robert Spano, judge and president of the European Court of Human Rights, visited Turkey where he met with President Erdogan and other government officials. In the face of government denial of massive human rights violations it is committing, the visit has raised huge concerns within Turkish civil society, undermining their trust and public confidence in the court.
The program of Spano's visit included an address to the Justice Academy and the acceptance of an honorary doctorate at Istanbul University. What the visit did not include was meetings with civil society human rights defendants. Former Turkish diplomat Aydın Selcan stated that Spano is not fit to preside over the ECHR. Cengiz Aktar, a political scientist and academic, called Spano's visit scandalous and urged him to resign. Exiled Turkish journalist Can Dündar wrote that Spano destroyed the 30-year reputation of the ECHR in 3 days. Especially concerning was Spano's acceptance of an honorary doctorate from Istanbul University, for which 95 academics were dismissed without due process or the opportunity for review, as a result of the crackdown on civil society and purges of academia by the Turkish authorities after an emergency decree declared in response to the 2016 failed coup attempt. Imprisoned journalist and former Istanbul University professor Mehmet Altan penned an open letter to Spano where he said, "The university from which you will receive a doctorate is included as a defendant institution in the lawsuits of academics like me who were dismissed by decree. These cases are still ongoing and it is likely that they will come before the ECHR, which you preside over." Former co-chair of the People's Democratic Party Selahattin Demirtaş's wife, Başak Demirtaş, is another name that penned an open letter to Judge Spano. In her invitation letter, Demirtaş stated, "You met Turkey's president, who did not implement the judgments your court delivered, and other government officials. If you were our guest in Diyarbakır, I would be glad to inform you about the cases of politicians from the opposition party, HDP, including my husband Selahattin Demirtaş, pending before the European Court of Human Rights. I have no doubt that you have had the chance to learn the position of the government from the authorities you have met. If you spend an hour with me, it will be enough to inform you about our position. I would be glad to offer you Diyarbakır's hospitality." The ECHR ranked Turkey second after Russia on its list of countries with the highest human rights violations recorded in 2019.
Netflix announced that it had postponed the release of the French movie Cuties from its Turkish portal. The movie, which was set to be released on September 9th, was said to allegedly promote child exploitation, according to Turkey's watchdog Rütük, and a block order was issued in accordance.
The French movie Cuties, directed by Maimouna Dekor, tells the story of an 11-year-old Senegalese Muslim girl living in France who is torn between her family's conservative lifestyle and the escape offered by her friend's dance troupe. The filmmaker Dekor won the World Cinema Dramatic Directing Awards at this year's Sundance Film Festival. The award-winning movie was then set to be released on Netflix. The movie's promotional poster was redesigned by Netflix. It showed 4 preteen girls in skin-bearing outfits and sexual poses, differed from the original French poster, and caused a global stir on social media last month for sexualizing young girls. Following this outrage, Netflix apologized for the inappropriate artwork that misrepresented the film and updated the picture along with the description. Following the global controversy, the director Maimouna Dekor has explained that the movie aims to highlight how social media forces young girls to mimic sexualized imagery without fully understanding what lies behind it or the dangers involved in it. Even though this online controversy caused people to sign a petition for promoting pedophilia on a global spectrum, no country tried to censor or remove content while fighting against hypersexualization of young girls and pedophilia. However, Turkey's newly implemented social media legislation gives the Radio and Television Supreme Council the authority to regulate online, radio, television, and on-demand broadcasting. Under these stricter social media and broadcasting laws, Netflix is required to comply with the request to censor or remove content from its Turkish platform. The Ministry of Family and Social Policy commented that the film may cause children to be open to negligence and abuse, which may negatively impact their psychological development. This is the first time that an international broadcast is taken down before it was released in Turkey. The majority of Rütük's members are from Erdogan's Justice and Development Party or their ally, National Movement Party, and they both fall into the conservative part of the political spectrum. The Rütük's review was through an unanimous conclusion that the movie violated a provision in the legislation that reads, "Broadcast services cannot include abuse against children, the weak, and the elderly, and cannot encourage violence." If Netflix fails to abide by the censor decision, Rütük has the power to temporarily suspend Netflix license. Even though the legislation does not approve removal of content prior to release, Rütük was able to censor the French movie before it was released.
That's all from This Week in Turkey. See you next Friday at 9 p.m. Good night.